By the time Al Copeland admitted something was wrong, the damage had already started. It didn't arrive with panic or drama. It came as a quiet discomfort he tried to explain away as just being tired. The restaurant was still open, the lights still worked, the fryers still ran. On paper, nothing had collapsed. But standing there, surrounded by stainless steel and fluorescent light, he felt a tension that just wouldn't leave. It was the unsettling awareness that sheer effort was no longer fixing the problem. Something deeper wasn't working, and he didn't yet know what it was. Copeland didn't come from money, but more importantly, he didn't come from stability. His early life taught him that structures were fragile and authority couldn't be trusted. School never made sense to him, not because he wasn't smart, but because the system demanded obedience before understanding. He dropped out early, carrying with him a core belief that would shape every decision he ever made. If you want control, you have to take it. Nobody just gives it to you. When he got into the restaurant business, it wasn't out of a deep passion for food or hospitality. Food was just tangible, you could adjust it immediately. You could change a recipe the same day you noticed it was failing. There was a real comfort in that kind of directness. In 1972, he opened a small fried chicken place in a New Orleans suburb called Chicken on the Run. The idea wasn't revolutionary. It was just a straightforward attempt to build something that worked in a city that understood good food. The restaurant failed, quickly but quietly. That was part of what made it so hard to process. Customers just didn't come back, the chicken didn't stand out. The numbers stopped making a convincing argument. There was no single bad decision to blame, no obvious villain to point a finger at. It was just a quiet mismatch between what he intended and what actually happened. For most people, this would have been a lesson. But for Copeland, it felt like a personal rejection. He didn't step back to rethink the market or the concept. Instead, he internalized the failure. Closing the restaurant didn't bring him any relief. It just created this deep irritation, a sense that the world had completely misunderstood him. Standing in that empty space, he didn't feel any wiser. He just felt challenged. And rather than walking away, he decided to reopen. The second attempt was anything but subtle. He renamed the restaurant Popeyes Mighty Good Chicken and leaned aggressively into bold, spicy Cajun flavors. The food became louder, more aligned with the fiery identity of New Orleans itself. This wasn't some calculated branding exercise. It was pure instinct. He wasn't trying to follow a trend. He was trying to create something that was impossible to ignore. The response was uneven at first, but it was different. Some customers hated it. Others came back specifically because it felt so bold. The restaurant didn't explode with success overnight, but it did create friction. People started talking about it. Not in headlines, not in numbers that brought any real comfort, but just enough to suggest the idea had some weight. For Copeland, that was all he needed to push forward. Expansion followed, and with it came a whole new set of problems he wasn't prepared for. Franchising allowed for rapid growth, but it also meant giving up control. Quality started to vary from one location to the next. Franchisees began to push back. Legal disputes piled up. Copeland responded to this resistance the only way he knew how, by pushing even harder. The belief that pure intensity could solve any structural problem stayed with him, even as his organization became more and more complex. At the same time, a huge shadow loomed over everything he was building. KFC already dominated America's relationship with fried chicken. It wasn't just a competitor. It was a national habit, a familiar comfort, and it had massive scale. Popeyes wasn't just selling food. It was asking people to fundamentally change their behavior. Copeland treated this like a personal fight, absolutely convinced that his sheer force of will could make up for what he lacked in experience and resources. From the outside, by the late 1980s, Popeyes looked like a huge success. Locations had multiplied, revenue was flowing. The brand was visible everywhere. But internally, the pressure was constant and crushing. Lawsuits were accumulating. Debt was quietly expanding. The company's governance was lagging far behind its explosive growth. Decisions that felt emotionally right in the moment were creating a fragile operational reality. Copeland wasn't blind to the risks. He just truly believed he could outrun them. Eventually, the numbers stopped bending to his will. The obligations tightened. His options narrowed. In 1989, Popeyes filed for bankruptcy. There was no single catastrophic moment, no dramatic collapse. It was simply the result of all that accumulated strain finally becoming impossible to ignore. The brand survived, but Al Copeland lost control of the company he had built from nothing. That separation mattered more than anyone publicly acknowledged at the time. Popeyes hadn't just been a business to him. It was his proof. It was evidence that his instincts were right, that defiance could sustain itself against all odds. Watching the brand continue on without him created a silence he hadn't anticipated. It raised a question he couldn't immediately answer. Had Popeyes outgrown him, or had it succeeded despite the very traits that built it? The story, of course, did not end there. But whatever came next would no longer be driven by pure confidence alone. Losing Popeyes wasn't like losing a company. For Al Copeland, it felt like losing proof. Proof that his gut instincts were always right. Proof that pure aggression could win out over patience. Proof that a force of personality was all you needed to carry the day indefinitely. When the bankruptcy finally ended and control officially shifted away from him, the silence that followed was deafening. It was louder than any courtroom shouting match. There were no reporters swarming him, no dramatic exits for the cameras. There was just the cold, unsettling quiet. The quiet realization that the empire he had built, the thing he once commanded, was now moving forward without needing his permission for anything. Publicly, Copeland didn't crumble. But inside, his very identity began to fracture. For years, conflict was his fuel. Opposition made him sharper. Even the endless lawsuits felt like a form of engagement, a battle to be won. But now, there was nothing left to push against. The brand that had demanded his attention every single hour of every day now existed somewhere else, run by people who didn't need to ask him a single thing. That distance created a strange psychological vacuum. He was no longer fighting. He was just watching. Now, financially, he wasn't rowing in the way most people assumed, but he was exposed. The myth of the invincible entrepreneur, the one who can't lose, doesn't really survive a close-up inspection. His legendary spending habits, fueled by years of massive success, hadn't slowed down when the risks started piling up. His fixed costs were enormous. The extravagant lifestyle he had so carefully constructed required constant momentum, and that momentum was gone. The pressure was no longer about ambition. It was about maintenance. Sleep became a luxury. Not because of dramatic movie-style breakdowns or panic attacks, but because unresolved thoughts don't like to rest. At night, his decisions would replay themselves over and over, always without a clear resolution. It wasn't the big, obvious mistakes that haunted him, it was the subtle ones. The little moments where a bit of restraint might have changed everything. The situations where he felt control was absolutely necessary. But in hindsight, maybe it wasn't. These late-night reflections didn't bring him clarity. They just brought irritation. Regret didn't soften him. It made him harder. He started hunting for another opportunity, not from a place of inspiration, but from pure discomfort. The goal wasn't to build something meaningful, it was to reassert his relevance. To prove, once and for all, that what happened with Popeyes was just a fluke, a perfect storm of circumstances, not a fundamental flaw in him or his methods. He explored buying other companies, new partnerships, and different restaurant concepts with varying levels of seriousness. A few almost worked out. Most of them didn't. The problem was no longer about getting in the door or having the confidence to make a deal. It was about alignment. Copeland's earlier success had been powered by raw instinct operating in a much simpler business world. But now, the game was more complex. It required patience, corporate governance, and self-restraint. These were not skills he naturally valued. To him, they felt slow, constraining, and completely unnecessary. And yet, without them, he couldn't make any real progress. He was stuck. This mismatch between his style and the new reality created a series of quiet, near failures. Deals that looked fantastic on paper would just unravel behind the scenes. Concepts that generated a lot of initial buzz would fail to keep anyone's interest. On top of all that, public perception added another layer of pressure. He was still famous. He was still the Popeyes guy. But the story had changed. Instead of being seen as the brilliant builder, he was increasingly being framed as a personality. A character. Someone defined more by his flashy lifestyle and aggressive persona than by his business execution. This wasn't entirely wrong, but it was dangerously incomplete. And when your own self-perception gets distorted by the public narrative, you start to lose your way. The lowest moment didn't arrive with a bang. It wasn't some huge catastrophe. It arrived quietly as a moment of terrible clarity. He was in a meeting, halfway through his own pitch for a new venture, when he realized something chilling. He didn't believe a word he was saying. The words sounded rehearsed, defensive, and even a little desperate. He noticed it as it was happening. And he knew, with sinking certainty, that the other people in the room noticed it too. The conversation ended politely, of course, but something fundamental had been exposed. He was no longer leading with conviction. He was negotiating with the memory of who he used to be. That single moment forced a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The old Al Copeland, the unstoppable force, was not coming back. The industry had changed. His position in it had changed. And pretending that he could just force his way back to the top wasn't boldness. It was denial. This realization didn't bring him peace. It brought pure, undiluted fear. Because when you let go of the only identity you've ever known, there's nothing there to immediately replace it. You're just adrift. The decision he made next wasn't heroic. It was pragmatic. He chose to step away from the desperate chase for relevance and instead focus on rebuilding his competence from the ground up. This meant accepting smaller roles, working on quieter projects, and embracing slower timelines. It meant operating without the spectacle, without the constant need for validation. For a man who had built his entire career on being visible, on confrontation, this shift felt like a profound humiliation. But humiliation, when it's private, can be a powerful teacher. He began investing in ventures that didn't have his name plastered all over them. In meetings, he started listening more than he spoke. Not out of some newfound humility, but out of sheer necessity. He watched how younger, newer operators structured their deals, how they managed growth, and how they limited their financial exposure. These weren't lessons he would ever admit he needed. They were lessons he absorbed simply by being in the room. Gradually, his decision-making began to change. Not in a big dramatic way. It was incremental. The signature recklessness that had once defined him didn't just vanish, it softened, it found boundaries. When new opportunities came along, he evaluated them with a kind of patience that would have felt completely foreign to him a decade earlier. He was no longer chasing scale for its own sake. His obsession shifted from just getting bigger to becoming sustainable. This wasn't about finding redemption through growth. It was about simple survival. Still, nothing really felt resolved. Success didn't come rushing back, and when it did, it was quieter, less public. It was far less satisfying than the spectacular wins of his past. There were days when he wondered if this adaptation was just a fancy word for surrender. He questioned whether his new restraint was a sign of wisdom or a sign of defeat. These doubts never went away. They just learned to coexist with progress. The true point of no return came not from another loss, but from acceptance. The acceptance that the version of success he had once chased so relentlessly had come at a cost he could no longer afford to pay. That realization closed certain doors for good. But it opened another less obvious one. It opened the possibility of building something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of its own urgency. The next phase of his obsession didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It didn't announce itself with excitement or fanfare. It crept in quietly, disguised as discipline. This is the story of a man named Copeland, and his radical transformation. He once chased attention, desperately trying to reclaim the spotlight he'd known. But then everything changed. His days began to narrow. There were fewer meetings, fewer voices, less noise. All that energy he once poured into confrontation, he redirected. Not to control others, but to control the process. He stopped trying to move fast and started trying to move correctly. His entire perspective on opportunity shifted. Early in his career, scale was the only signal that mattered. Bigger meant better. More locations meant progress. Visibility meant relevance. But now scale felt suspicious. Every expansion brought more questions than confidence. Could this business survive real pressure? Could it function if he wasn't there to intervene? Could it fail quietly without taking everything else down with it? These weren't inspiring questions, but they were necessary. He started focusing on businesses where structure was more important than personality, where systems outlasted charisma, and where leadership meant absence, not constant presence. This shift was deeply uncomfortable. It forced him to face a truth he had avoided for years. So much of his earlier success depended on him being everywhere at once. And he realized that wasn't strength. It was fragility, disguised as control. His competitors no longer felt like enemies. They became signals, proof that the market rewards consistency far more than it rewards bravado. Copeland watched how others expanded quietly, how they standardized their operations, how they focused on reducing risk instead of just chasing the upside. None of this seemed glamorous. And that was precisely why it worked. When progress finally returned, it didn't make a sound. There were no headlines, no sudden surges of recognition. Instead, there were months where nothing went wrong. Contracts held, costs stayed predictable. Teams functioned without a constant state of crisis. This quiet, this absence of chaos, became the new metric for success. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling at first, but it was solid. It endured. The money followed, but it arrived differently than before. It wasn't about dramatic leaps or bold, risky bets anymore. It accumulated slowly, steadily, tied to repeatable performance. This kind of growth demanded a new skill, patience. It also demanded restraint. Copeland had to learn to resist the powerful impulse to interfere when things were working. He had to learn to trust the systems he'd built, to let them do what they were designed to do, even when he felt they were moving too slowly. Public perception, of course, lagged far behind this new reality. To many, he was still just the Popeyes guy, as if his story had ended there. He never corrected them. He saw no advantage in trying to explain a complex evolution to an audience that prefers simple, familiar narratives. Quiet competence doesn't photograph well, it doesn't fit neatly into a legacy story. But it has a secret power, it compounds. Pressure never really disappears, though. It just changes its shape. Instead of external conflicts and battles with rivals, the tension became internal. It was the constant knowledge that one reckless decision could unravel years of careful, meticulous rebuilding. It was knowing that the margin for error actually gets smaller as stability increases. Success was no longer something to chase. It was something to protect. There were moments, of course, when he missed the raw intensity of those earlier years. He missed the clarity that comes from fighting obvious battles, from having a clear enemy to defeat. Stability, he learned, demanded a different kind of energy. It required vigilance, not adrenaline. It required showing up day after day, even when nothing dramatic was happening. And he found that this kind of consistency was far harder to master than ambition had ever been. The peak didn't arrive as a moment of triumph. There was no finish line to cross. It came as a quiet confirmation. A realization, years into this new phase, that the systems he had helped build could actually survive without him. That decisions made months earlier were still holding up under pressure. That the growth, while slower, was durable. This wasn't the kind of flashy success he had once imagined for himself. But it was real. And in that moment, he understood something profound. His early wins had proven he could build something quickly, This new phase proved he could build something that lasted. And that difference mattered more than anything. Not for his reputation, but for his peace of mind. What followed wasn't an ending, it was a threshold. Beyond it waited a different kind of challenge, one that no balance sheet or financial statement could ever resolve. It was the bill coming due, the true cost of everything that had come before, and the lingering question of what, if anything, all this success was ever supposed to repair. This journey from chaotic growth to quiet stability is a powerful lesson for anyone building a business, a career, or even a life. It's a reminder that the most durable successes are often the ones built in silence, far from the spotlight. Success did not arrive as closure. It arrived as responsibility. By the time Popeyes had fully separated from all Copeland's direct control and grown into a global brand, the question of winning no longer made sense to him. There was no finish line to cross, no moment where effort could finally stop. What remained was a life shaped by decisions whose consequences continued unfolding long after the applause had moved elsewhere. From the outside, it appeared as though everything had worked out. The brand was stronger than ever. The business had proven durable. His name remained permanently linked to one of the most recognizable food chains in the world. Yet internally, the experience felt unfinished. Not broken, but unresolved. Success has stabilized the external world, but it had not simplified the internal one. Time became more noticeable, not in dramatic ways, but through limitation. Energy was no longer infinite. Recovery took longer. The physical cost of decades spent under pressure became unavoidable. Health concerns emerged gradually, without spectacle, demanding attention he once refused to give. These were not consequences he could negotiate with or outwork. They required acceptance. And acceptance did not come easily to someone who had spent his life pushing forward. The irony was difficult to ignore. He had built systems designed to operate without him, yet his own life had been structured around constant involvement. When the business no longer required his presence, the absence exposed something uncomfortable. Without conflict, without urgency, without the need to prove anything, there was space. And space forces reflection. Copeland began to understand that much of what had driven him was not ambition alone, but resistance. Resistance to being overlooked. Resistance to limitation. Resistance to the idea that anyone else could decide the terms of his future. Popeyes had been the most visible expression of that resistance. Letting go of it did not erase the impulse. It simply removed its outlet. Legacy entered the conversation quietly. Not as a goal, but as a question. What remained when control was gone? The answer was not flattering or romantic. What remained were systems, habits, and standards that continued to shape outcomes without referencing intent. The brand no longer needed his story. It needed consistency. That realization reframed everything. Popeyes did not succeed because of personality. It endured because of repetition. Customers did not return for origin myths or entrepreneurial grit. They returned because the product met expectation. Again and again. The lesson was uncomfortable because it contradicted the narrative Copeland had lived by for decades. The most durable form of success was not expressive. It was dependable. As years passed, the brand expanded into markets he had never personally touched. New leadership teams made decisions he would not have made. Marketing shifted, menus evolved. The company adapted to cultural and economic changes that did not ask for his opinion. Watching this unfold thus unproduced jealousy. It produced distance. And distance allowed honesty. He could finally admit what had worked and what had not. Aggression had opened doors, but it had also shortened relationships. Confidence had accelerated growth, but it had delayed learning. Control had protected quality early on, but it had nearly destroyed scalability. These truths did not cancel each other out. They coexisted. Philanthropy entered his life not as redemption, but as realism. He understood that influence creates imbalance, whether intentional or not. The success of Popeyes has shifted resources, opportunities, and attention in his direction. Giving back was not an act of generosity. It was an acknowledgement of imbalance. He supported causes quietly, without branding or narrative repair. Not because humility demanded it, but because spectacle no longer served a purpose. There were still moments of restlessness. Success did not cure that. If anything, it made it more visible. Without immediate problems to solve, the mind wandered toward unresolved questions. Could things have been done differently? Would patience earlier have changed outcomes later? These questions no longer demanded answers. They existed as reminders, not instructions. What surprised him most was how little the public story mattered in the end. Interviews faded. Headlines aged. New entrepreneurs replaced old ones in the cultural imagination. Popeyes remained, but his name became a footnote rather than a headline. This did not feel like erasure. It felt appropriate. Brands, he learned, are not monuments. They are tools. They serve until they are replaced. Success fixed many things. It fixed insecurity. It fixed dependence. It fixed the fear of being irrelevant. But it did not fix the deeper tension between ambition and contentment. That negotiation continued, long after the business outcomes were settled. No amount of money resolved it completely. The most honest reflection he could offer was this. The journey was not heroic. It was accumulative. Nothing happened all at once. There was no moment where everything clicked. Progress emerged through correction, not revelation. Through facing consequences rather than avoiding them. Through letting go of the version of himself that needed to be right more than it needed to be effective. In the end, the story of Popeyes was not about chicken, competition, or even business. It was about learning the difference between force and durability, between presence and structure, between success that depends on you and success that survives you. And if you stayed with this story until now, it probably wasn't because it promised transformation or easy answers. It was because it refused to lie. Because it showed success without decoration. Because it treated growth as something earned, paid for, and imperfect. If this kind of honesty matters to you, if stories like this stay with you longer than motivation ever does, then you already understand why this channel exists. Not to inspire you loudly, but to respect your intelligence quietly. This story is real, and that's why it matters. Thank you for watching, and if you like more stories told this way, please consider subscribing.